My son, who never worked a day in his life, smirked. You should pay my bills forever, that's what parents are for. When I told him he'd have to get a job, he snapped. I'll just move in with Grandma, she actually cares about me. But the next day, he stormed back in furious, shouting. She said the same thing you did. I smiled. Guess that means we're both right. I never thought I'd be here, watching my grown son throw a tantrum like a child because I told him to get a job. But here we are. Let me introduce you to my son, Nick. Nick is 25 years old. Nick has never had a job. Nick has never paid a bill in his life. Nick lives in my house, eats my food, uses my Wi-Fi, and treats every penny I earn like it's his personal spending money. And for years I let him. I don't know when I screwed up as a parent, but somewhere along the way, Nick convinced himself that working was optional. He had this idea that parents were supposed to take care of their kids forever, no matter what. The man had the nerve to sit on my couch all day, watching TV and scrolling on his phone, while I worked 10-hour shifts to keep the lights on. If I ever brought up getting a job, he'd roll his eyes. Why would I do that? You have money. If I ever mentioned him paying rent, he'd laugh. Why would I pay to live here? I'm your son. It got worse when he started using my credit card. I came home from work one night, exhausted, just wanting to sit down for 5 minutes. Instead, I opened my front door and saw a mountain of delivery boxes in the living room. Sneakers. Electronics. Clothes. A PlayStation 5. Thousands of dollars in purchases, all piled up in the middle of my house. Nick! I shouted. He strolled in, licking pizza grease off his fingers like nothing was wrong. Oh yeah, I used your card, he said like it was no big deal. I grabbed a receipt off the top box. $1,200. You what? I needed some new stuff, he said, waving me off. You haven't bought me anything in a while. I felt something snap. Nick, you stole from me? He laughed. Relax, Dad. You make good money. I was done. You have 30 days to get a job and start paying rent, I said. Or you're out. Nick's smug grin disappeared. You're joking. Nope. You wouldn't dare. Watch me. He stared at me, waiting for me to back down. When I didn't, his face twisted with rage. Fine, he snapped. I'll just move in with Grandma. She actually loves me. I almost laughed. My mother, his grandmother, grew up dirt poor, worked her entire life, and hates freeloaders. But I didn't argue. I just nodded. Go ahead. Nick smirked, thinking he had won. The next morning, he packed up his things and left with his nose in the air. I enjoyed the most peaceful night I'd had in years. No loud music, no random strangers in my fridge, no arguments. Then, less than 24 hours later, there was furious banging on my door. I opened it to find Nick standing there, red-faced, fists clenched. She said the same thing you did, he shouted. I smiled. Guess that means we're both right. Nick stood in my doorway, shaking with anger. His face was red, his fists clenched. She said the same thing you did, he shouted, like I was supposed to be shocked. I smirked. Guess that means we're both right. That set him off. You guys are insane, he yelled, pacing back and forth on my porch. Grandma's supposed to love me, but she just threw me out like trash. And all because I don't want to be a wage slave like you two. You're not a slave, Nick. You're an adult. Adults work. That's how the world works. I am working, he shot back. I was up all night grinding in Call of Duty. I could be a streamer if you just support me for a while. I stared at him. You really think playing video games in my basement is a career plan? Yeah. Tons of people make money gaming. You just don't get it. I rubbed my temples. Nick, you don't even have a Twitch account. You just sit around and play for yourself. He crossed his arms like a child. Well, if you weren't kicking me out, I could focus on building my brand. I sighed. Nick, what do you want from me? He didn't hesitate. Let me move back in. No rent, no job stuff, just let me do my thing. And stop stressing me out with all this responsibility garbage. I laughed so hard I almost fell over. Oh no, I said. You made your choice. You're on your own. Nick's face twisted with pure rage. Fine. He spat. I'll figure it out myself. But when I make it big, don't come crawling back to me for help. And just like that, he stormed off into the night. For the next few weeks, I barely heard anything about Nick. From what little I could gather, he bounced between friends' places, wearing out his welcome wherever he went. Nobody wanted to support a grown man who contributed nothing but dirty laundry and a bad attitude. Then, one day, I got a call from my mother. You'll never believe where I just saw your son. Oh, I could guess. Where? I asked. She let out a bitter chuckle. Down at the gas station on Broadway. Holding up a sign that says, "Need money for food. Anything helps." I nearly dropped my phone. What? He's begging? Oh, it gets worse, she said. I went up to him, and you know what he had the nerve to say to me? I already knew it would be bad. What? He said, "Hey Grandma, can I borrow $100? I closed my eyes and exhaled. And I laughed in his face. A long pause. Son, she continued, I think it's time you go see for yourself. That night I drove down Broadway. Sure enough, there he was. Nick. My son. He was slumped on the curb, hoodie up, staring at the ground. His cardboard sign leaned against his knee. I parked across the street and just watched him for a while. Every few minutes someone walked by and dropped $1 or some coins. He mumbled a half-hearted, "Thanks," but never looked up. At one point, a group of teenagers walked past and laughed at him. One of them tossed an empty soda can at his feet. He didn't even react. This was rock bottom. I got out of my car and crossed the street. When I stopped in front of him, he slowly looked up. His eyes widened. Dad? Get in the car. Nick stared at me, his face hollow and pale under the streetlights. His hoodie was pulled tight over his head, his jeans dirt-streaked, and his shoes, once pristine, probably bought with my stolen money, were scuffed and worn. I expected him to jump up and scramble into the car. Instead, he just sat there. You here to rub it in? He muttered. I sighed. Get in the car, Nick. He shook his head, looking away. Nah. That caught me off guard. What do you mean, nah? I'm fine here. I glanced at the cardboard sign leaning against his knee. It was barely readable, something about being hungry, needing a bus ticket, whatever story he thought would work on passing strangers. Nick, I said, lowering my voice. You're begging on the street. You're not fine. He snorted. I made almost $40 today. My hands clenched. You mean to tell me you'd rather sit here and ask strangers for money than get in my car and come home? He lifted his chin, like he was daring me to challenge him. I don't need you. I could have lost it right then and there. But something about the way he said it, the slight waver in his voice, the way his fingers twitched, told me something else was going on. And that's when I noticed something strange. About 15 feet away, standing half in the shadows of the gas station, was a man. Mid-40s, wiry, wearing a beat-up denim jacket. His eyes flickered between me and Nick, his posture stiff. Nick must have noticed me looking because he shifted uncomfortably. Nick, I said carefully. Who's that? No one, he said quickly. Too quickly. I turned my full attention to the man. You know my son? The guy smirked. He's been crashing with me and my boys for a few nights now. I felt my stomach drop. Nick. My idiot, entitled spoiled son, was hanging around with homeless drifters? Before I could say anything, the guy took a slow step forward. Hey man, he said. You should be proud. Kids learning to survive out here. Gotta respect that. Nick flinched. And that's when I realized he was scared. His whole body was tense, his hands gripping the edge of the curb. He wouldn't look at the guy. Nick, I said, my voice low, steady. Get in the car. The guy laughed. What's the rush? We take care of each other, don't we, Nicky boy? Nick swallowed hard. I moved before I could think. Stepped between them, my stance firm. I wasn't a violent man, but I had never felt more like throwing a punch in my life. I said, I repeated, eyes locked on Nick. Get in the car. Nick hesitated. And then the guy muttered, just loud enough for Nick to hear. Better make the right choice, kid. Would be a real shame if you made the wrong one. I don't know what Nick saw in that moment, maybe a future even he wasn't dumb enough to gamble on, but suddenly, he was on his feet. He grabbed his bag, a filthy old backpack I didn't even recognize, and brushed past me. I kept my eyes on the man. Neither of us spoke. Then, as Nick yanked open the car door, the guy took a step back into the shadows. And just like that, he was gone. For the first time in his life, Nick was silent. I drove, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. Every few minutes, I'd glance at him. He just stared out the window, hunched in on himself. You were living with those guys? I finally asked. No answer. Nick. He shifted. I didn't have anywhere else to go. I wanted to scream. Are you insane? That guy. I struggled to keep my voice steady. That guy was dangerous. You think those people cared about you? You think they were your friends? His jaw clenched. They let me stay. They were using you. He scoffed. For what? I had nothing. I shot him a look. You had something they wanted. Or you would have, eventually. He fell silent again. I exhaled. Tell me the truth, Nick. Did you owe them something? More silence. Nick, I don't know, all right? He exploded. They gave me a place to crash, they shared food, but then. He cut himself off, shaking his head. I don't know, okay? I just knew I needed to get out. I tightened my grip on the wheel. He was lucky. Stupidly, unbelievably lucky. If I hadn't gone looking for him. I didn't want to finish that thought. We drove in silence the rest of the way. When we pulled into the driveway, Nick didn't move. I turned off the car and looked at him. Come inside. He let out a bitter laugh. Oh, now you want me back? I sighed. Nick. Do you want to keep living like that? On the street? With people like him? His hands curled into fists in his lap. I softened my voice. Come inside. Take a shower. Eat real food. And then. I leveled him with a look. We're talking about next steps. He swallowed. For the first time in years he looked lost. What if I mess up again? He muttered. I stared at him. Then you deal with the consequences. Like an adult. A long silence. Then, finally, he nodded. And got out of the car. Nick stepped inside the house for the first time in months. He looked around like he barely recognized the place. I didn't say a word as he shuffled toward the couch and dropped his filthy backpack onto the floor. I walked to the kitchen and grabbed 2 plates. I didn't expect him to say thank you as I set a hot plate of food in front of him. He just stared at it, then picked up his fork. For a while, the only sound was the clinking of silverware against ceramic. I sat across from him and finally broke the silence. Tell me everything. Nick didn't look up. What do you mean? I said slowly. How the hell did you end up there? He let out a bitter laugh. You kicked me out, remember? I clenched my jaw. No, Nick. I gave you a choice. You refused to get a job. You refused to grow up. And then you chose to leave. He pushed his plate away, his appetite suddenly gone. I went to Grandma's. That didn't work out. Yeah, because she told you the same thing I did. His lips pressed into a thin line. Then I stayed with some friends. They let me crash for a while, but you know, people get tired of you after a couple of weeks. I nodded. And then? His eyes flickered to his backpack on the floor. He didn't answer. I leaned forward. Nick. He rubbed his face and exhaled sharply. Then I met Manny. I stiffened. The guy from the gas station? Nick hesitated, then nodded. He said he had a place I could stay. A group of guys who looked out for each other. No rent, no rules. I stared at him. You actually thought that was safe? I didn't have a choice. He snapped. I was sleeping on a park bench. I was starving. What was I supposed to do? I slammed my hand on the table, making him jump. You were supposed to learn, Nick. I roared. You were supposed to figure it out like every other adult. He shot up from his chair, breathing hard. I didn't know what to do, okay? I thought they were helping me. I stood too, pointing at him. They weren't helping you, Nick. They were grooming you. His face paled. That's not true. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my texts. After I found you, I did some digging. Manny? He's got priors. Drug charges. Theft. Human trafficking. Nick's whole body locked up. You're lying. I held up my phone, showing him the mugshot. Tell me I'm lying, Nick. His breathing went ragged. I didn't know. No, I said, voice shaking. You didn't want to know. I saw something shift in his face then, something like fear. And that's when I pressed the final blow. If I hadn't come for you. I let the words hang, letting him fill in the blank. Nick stumbled back a step. He knew. Nick barely spoke for the next 2 days. He stayed in his room, barely ate, barely made eye contact. I gave him space. Then, on the 3rd day, I walked in to find him sitting on the floor, his knees pulled to his chest. You were right, he muttered. I sighed and sat down across from him. About what? His eyes were red. All of it. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, finally I said, What do you want to do now? He looked up at me. I don't know how to fix this. I nodded. It starts with a job. A shaky breath. Then, okay. Nick got his first job at a warehouse. He hated it. He was sore, exhausted, and miserable after every shift. But he didn't quit. Over the months, I saw the change in him, real, actual change. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he was trying. One night, after a particularly brutal shift, he collapsed onto the couch next to me. "I don't know how you did this every day," he admitted. I smirked. "Because I had to." He ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah. I get that now." And just like that, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. I don't know if Nick will ever fully change. I don't know if he'll slip up, or backslide, or screw up again. But for the first time in his life, I think he understands the weight of his choices. And that's enough, for now.